This is a transcript of the sermon preached by Kathy Bevan on the 27th of October 2019 at Great Lumley Methodist Church as part of our series on stories of faith. And this week we're focusing on the story of Esther. In some way, each of the stories of faith we've looked at over the last 5 weeks have contained an element of obedience. Daniel, Ruth, Elijah, Deborah and David all obeying God's laws and calling in their lives despite challenging circumstances. Today we consider the faith and obedience of Esther, a young Jewish girl, maybe in her early teens, elevated to a position of influence in the royal court primarily because of her beauty, although ultimately it's her faith, intelligence and obedience that enables her to succeed. The book of Esther is somewhat contentious among Bible scholars, primarily because it doesn't mention God at all. If anything, the book of Esther is a relatively accessible story of a woman's life of faithful obedience that we can relate to. I go so far as to say we all could be Esther, albeit in different ways. While not many of us are likely to find ourselves among the ranks of the royal family or even promoted for our exceptional beauty, we can all share the experience of being in a place for God's purposes. In reading her story, I was there to reflect on why it can be difficult to be obedient like Esther and what it is that we might need in order to obey God's will in our lives. I'll share some of that in a moment, but let me ask you a question first. Have you ever done something grudgingly rather than willingly? I guess most of us have probably, at one time or another, acted because we've had to rather than in willing obedience. If you can call to mind those particular circumstances just now, then it's likely that the cause of your grudge was either that you didn't entirely agree with the purpose of the reason that you were required to obey, or perhaps you didn't trust the person or people who'd asked you to obey. Or maybe you were concerned for your own well-being in the process. In the story of Esther, I think we see the opposite of those things I've just mentioned that stop us obeying. In Esther, we see someone committed to the purpose of saving the Jewish people, someone who trusts Mordecai and God, and someone who's more concerned with saving others than with self-preservation. So let's think about those things now. Firstly, Esther had a strong belief in her purpose, which is a critical first step to obedience. There's no doubt that obedience is considerably harder if you don't believe in the purpose of your actions. Just ask a child who doesn't want to go to bed. I'm sure I've probably referred before to a business book that I found particularly useful, Start With Why by Simon Sinek. It's about knowing your purpose before you start out on a task. He says it matters less what you do and more why you do it. I'd take that a step further and say that when our purpose is clear and aligned in both our heads and hearts, then what we do becomes almost automatic. When we practice obedience to God in the small, everyday aspects of our lives, surely it becomes easier to be obedient when God asks something more significant from us. As a young Jewish girl, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin, we can assume Esther would have had some level of understanding of the scriptures, would have been brought up in a close-knit Jewish community, so she would understand the responsibility that the entire community felt towards protecting each other and their ultimate aim of regaining their status and their homelands. Esther would have known and understood when the time came that her purpose was to protect her people. In chapter 2, we're told that Esther was taken into the palace, along with a selection of other girls, from which the king would choose his new queen. It doesn't sound like she particularly pushed herself forward, she was simply swept along in the process. Yet despite God not being implicitly mentioned in the book of Esther, we can clearly see his hand at work, placing Esther where she needs to be for his purposes. I wonder how often we try to outplan God, to think that we know best where we can serve his purposes, rather than letting him carry us to where he needs us to be and to use us there. We also see Esther's trust in God's purposes and her trust in Mordecai's interpretation of what needs to be done to fulfill these purposes. Mordecai, who's Esther's guardian, has brought her up as his own daughter, so it's perhaps natural that she trusts him when he tells her not to share the fact that she's Jewish. But trust is something that's built and earned. It's not an automatic privilege, and we see a little of the way Mordecai has earned Esther's trust when we read that he walks in the courtyards each day to check that she's okay. It's on one of these walks that Mordecai discovers the plot to kill the king, and so he gets word to Esther to tell her to warn the king. We again see Esther demonstrating obedience because of her trust in Mordecai. The subsequent plot by Haman to kill the Jewish people is on a much greater scale, and Esther needs encouragement from someone she trusts before she practices obedience, and in doing so she puts the needs of others ahead of concern for her own welfare. Initially, Esther's reaction is one which perhaps we can empathise with, one of helplessness. What can I do? She tells Mordecai she cannot approach the king without being summoned, because she'll be killed. Since the king has not summoned her in 30 days, she believes she must have fallen out of favour with him, and is therefore more likely to be killed. But Mordecai, via the messenger, challenges her, "For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows, perhaps you've come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Mordecai recognises the hand of God in Esther's life and reminds her that if she does not play her part, then someone else will. In other words, our disobedience won't stop God's plans, but our obedience surely sees the fulfilment of those plans sooner and brings us blessing in the process. Many years after the story of Esther, when St. Paul wrote to the early and developing church in Rome, he reminded them, "For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you." It's that kind of sober judgment that Esther uses, not thinking so highly of herself that it prevents her doing what is needed, and suddenly the fear that she felt becomes fuel to her courage and obedience. Mordecai also gets Esther to consider that perhaps she's come to her current situation for the purpose of being able to fulfill this action, to play her part in God's plan. It's interesting for us to consider that God may have placed us right where we are for his purposes, and that we could miss out on what God intends if we always think that God will lead us somewhere else first. Could we be in our current circumstances for just such a time as this, whatever that this may be? Are we sometimes failing to act because we're looking inward instead of outward? Are we considering our own security, comfort and well-being ahead of the needs of others? It's true that someone else will always come forward if we don't, but how much more easily would God's plans be fulfilled, and how much would we be blessed in the process if we obey right now? At this point in the story, we again see the hand of God protecting Esther, as she does indeed approach the king unsummoned, and he acts favourably towards her rather than having her killed. But notice, though, that in her obedience, Esther prepares before going to address the king. She instructs Mordecai to have the people fast for 3 days and nights before she approaches the king. She could have rushed straight in, but she clearly knows and trusts the Jewish practice of fasting and preparation before undertaking such a significant task. It's not a question of procrastination. Rather, that diligent and godly preparation focuses and enhances the actions of an obedient heart. Esther is a biblical heroine who gained a position of status and power outside of her culture. We read that she was unusually allowed to send letters initiating the festival of Purim, something unheard of for a woman at that time. Perhaps this was one of the earliest records of girl power. The important thing, whether male or female, was that Esther succeeded because of her obedience, and her obedience came from a deep understanding of purpose, a trust in God and also in Mordecai, who instructed her, and a sense of working for the greater good rather than preserving self. And of course, it came from good preparation. I read recently, by the power of Facebook, about another young girl who could be described as a modern-day Esther, Sophie Scholl. A 21-year-old German girl, Sophie was executed during the war after being caught distributing anti-war leaflets at the University of Munich. At the point of her death by guillotine, Sophie said these words, "But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action?" Sophie had a Christian upbringing. She'd enjoyed a comfortable life, was attending university at the outbreak of war. Initially a member of the Hitler Youth, she joined the resistance like her brother Hans because she trusted his belief and that of her father in a better world. She profoundly disagreed with the ideology of Nazi Germany, and she began a regime of anti-violent or passive resistance, knowing full well what would happen if she was caught. Like Esther, Sophie could have chosen not to act and to safeguard her own life, but ultimately she sacrificed her life for others. There are countless examples of people like Esther and Sophie across history, people who viewed their own life as being of less importance than the greater common purpose. And in every generation, God seems to raise up new Esthers who demonstrate faithful obedience no matter what the personal cost. Secular society would have us believe we are just here to enjoy life, to get the most out of it, to accumulate enough wealth so we can have a comfortable retirement and then leave the planet largely untouched by our existence. Maybe there's nothing wrong with that, but really, what is the point? I don't want to get into a debate about the meaning of life. Suffice to say that as Christians we believe we're created for a greater purpose. Perhaps that's something you might like to think about personally. As Christians, or people exploring faith, we are fortunate to have the example of people like Esther, but crucially we have the example of Jesus. We see in Jesus a life lived in obedience to God's will, a man whose life's purpose was to save others, to bring about a healing to society, to challenge and restructure the prejudice and inequality that was destroying the whole world and God's people. And there's a very real need for us, as followers of Jesus, to be obedient to his example, do the same in our world today. Let me say to you tonight that perhaps we are each in our current situations for just such a time as this. Perhaps we need to tune ourselves more closely to the purposes of God, be ready to act in obedience, whether that comes in response to direct instruction from God himself, or from those we trust as his messengers. But as I said earlier, we'll only succeed when we clearly know and understand God's purposes, when we meditate on the word of God and live out our lives, which are dedicated to the obedient fulfilment of his purposes. We're going to have a short time of reflection now to consider ourselves and our obedience to God. It might be helpful to think about how aligned you feel to God's purposes, or how much you trust in God and those people he provides as messengers. Perhaps there are examples in your own life where you felt God call you to fulfill his purposes, and you obeyed, or perhaps there were times when you felt unable to obey, and you might want to think about those. Maybe the story of Esther leads you to think about how much you value your place and your own life, and whether that prevents or enables your obedience. After this time of reflection, I'm going to sing a song and the words for the chorus will appear on the screen. Please join in if you feel able to, in an act of dedicating ourselves to faithful obedience.